Alright, now this is a suggestion for the DMs in the way that you run your overarching world. And it might be one that people who know me find a little bit surprising. But what I'm going to suggest is in your games, DMs, don't use gods. Now, you might be wondering what I mean by that. And you might be assuming that what I'm saying is no divine beings, no clerics, no paladins, take all of that stuff out, just have magic and low fantasy, and that's all. We don't want any spiritual stuff. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. And let me place my cards on the table. I'm a fantasy author with theology qualifications, so I'm not anti-God. What I'm saying is really that the term gods is so loaded and confusing that it's gotten to the point where it's not really all that useful anymore. See, if you talk about gods to 5 different players, you're going to get 20 different opinions on exactly what that means. And people are going to have different perspectives on what power a god would have in this world that you're presenting them, or what they're like, what their character is, or what their relationship with humans or other sentient races are, whether they're good or bad. There's going to be all these different perspectives. Even if you lay some of that out, there's still assumptions that come depending on the player. So, just for example, if you tell someone about a god, let's say Bahamut, the Platinum Dragon god, depending on who you're talking to, they might have different perspectives on, is Bahamut omniscient? Does he see everything that goes on in the world all the time? Or does he only have his eyes on certain places and times, and he misses things, so he has to have details brought to him? Can he go back in time and see things? Or because if you are thinking pagan Greek god versus Judeo-Christian god, those answers are quite different. So people's assumptions are different. Another flow through of that idea is clerical power is quite often thought to be the god's intervention. So the idea is the cleric calls for help from their god and their god intervenes. So the power for a cure wounds is coming straight from the god. But does that mean the god's attention is on that situation right there and then, and they are directly casting that spell on behalf of the cleric? Or does that mean that somehow they've empowered the cleric and then they've gone away to do something else? Because again, different people's perspectives on what the word God means will change their assumption about that. Another question is, how powerful are they? Are we talking like the Q from Star Trek, or like a genie that effectively they can grant wishes? They can just will things into being. Or are they more like sort of Greek and Roman gods, which have powers, but there's limits to them, and there's very much this sense that you can have wars between gods and they have limitations in terms of what they can do as they fight their battles, and how much power does a god have? Can they intervene and just make stuff happen? And the reason they don't a lot of the time is just because they're not paying attention? Or is there things that limit them? Is there a limit to their power? Terry Pratchett introduced us to another idea very strongly. It may have been there before, but he was one of the ones who brought it to the fore, of the idea of God's power being dependent on their worshippers. So the more worshippers a god has, the more power they have. And if they lose worshippers, then they actually drop down in significance and power and what they can and can't do. Whereas there's a lot of understandings of theology and understandings of what a god is where that's just not even on the table. The idea is God, and your worship has nothing to do with their power or their capability or their importance. And then another question is, how human-like are they? Are the good gods divine and unselfish and purely good and always dedicated to the right and good, and you could never expect anything else from them? Or is there a politicalness to them? Are the bad gods utterly evil and malignant? Or is there an element of could understand their story when you hear it and you realize where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And all these things come into play when you use the term gods, and people will have different perspectives. And in something like Critical Role, you actually kind of see that come into play as these player characters meet the gods, and they have quite a few different perspectives on what the gods must be like and how much respect they're due, and you see their opinions changing as they meet the god, and in some cases it seems like the PCs don't even realize that a god isn't aware of something. So there's all these questions about what does it mean to be a god. So my question is, why don't we retire the term? Now, I'm not saying don't have divine beings. What I'm saying is invent your own divine beings. Now, there are a lot of fantasy contexts which do this. So a classic example, Tolkien is the father of most modern fantasy, or that's the way he's perceived. And he doesn't have gods in his story. He has the Valar, which are these sort of beings that have a little bit of archangelness to them and a little bit of pagan god to them. And there is a creator god behind it all, Eru Iluvatar, but he sort of has this backseat role. He does the creating and then does a few things and then steps back, and he's only ever called upon very occasionally. And even the Valar, when you read Lord of the Rings, they're referenced here and there, but you barely hear about them. They are these incredibly powerful figures. And the one you probably hear most about is Morgoth, who is the sort of father of Sauron, or the boss of Sauron, effectively. And he was the one that fell, so he's the Satan figure of that world. And Tolkien has this quite distinct idea about what the Valar are and what they're capable of and who follows them and how good or bad they are and how corruptible they are. And you don't need to drag in any concepts of a god when you're reading this, because you are taking it at face value. You're saying they're godlike, but these are the Valar. So what are the rules about the Valar? What can they do? The game's Elder Scrolls, particularly Morrowind, has good examples of this. They also have the Anticipations, which are these three god figures that you meet that eventually you find out, when you meet them in person, you find out they're actually mortals that have stolen power and upgraded themselves to divine beings. So there's this sort of sense of they are both mortal and fallible, and they have a divine element to them at the same time. And if you play the game Morrowind, you see sort of what happens to a number of them, or follow the Elder Scrolls lore later. And Elder Scrolls also has the Daedra, which are these figures that are sort of, in some ways, godlike, the Daedric princes, but a lot of them are quite dark and quite corrupt, and there's a few of them that are regarded as good, but even those have these sort of creepy elements when you read their lore. And there's also the Aedra, which are beings that you meet in Oblivion more. They are referred to in Morrowind, but Oblivion and Skyrim, they feature more, that are more like what we would imagine as Roman gods. But even then, there's this sense of these are beings that fit into this world, so we'll call them gods as a shorthand. But they are the Aedra, and there are rules about what they do, and the fact that one of them is ascended from a mortal, rather like the Raven Queen in D&D. And in my own books, I have what's called the Archai, which are these sort of caretaker, guardian, angel beings, which originally there were only 7 of them, and now there are less, and there's this story of what has happened to them and what their perspectives on mortals is. But they're not archangels, they're not gods, they're something different. So what I'm saying is we can have godlike beings, we can have clerics and paladins that follow them, but let's not call them gods. Let's not have god beings, because that's in some ways a lazy way to storytell. It's a lazy way to do fantasy. And what we get is this real confusion about what is entailed with your divine beings. Whereas if we just retire that term and we create our own beings and use our own term, whether you call them the Anticipations or the Divines or the Malevolence and the Benevolence, I don't know what you'd call the neutral ones, maybe you call them the Indifference. But whatever the term is, you come up with your own term and then you set the rules. And the players are taking the cues from you about what these beings are and how much they know and how positively inclined they are towards mortals and what power they will and will not offer and what the limits of what they can do is. And you get to set that. You get to make up all that. You might make them fairly weak. You might actually have some kind of subplot where all of them are ascended mortals. And they all fight like Greek gods and they're all fallible. So there's this whole political thing that none of them have clean motives and all of them have a nastiness to them. And all of them have limits to their power. Or you could make them all incredibly powerful, like the Q from Star Trek, if you follow that at all. But these beings that can just cast wish spells at demand. But the problem with that one is you then have to come up with rules for, if they're that powerful, why don't the good ones just change the world so bad things don't happen? Why is my mother dying if there's good beings that just wish the world how they want it? And why don't the bad ones just conquer the world for their own ends? You might come up with your own reasons for that. You might say they're all constantly at war and they keep each other in check. Or you might have something like the Divine Gate featured in Critical Role that is this barrier that they're all trapped on the far side of and they can only poke through a little bit of power. Or you might have something completely different as to why. They might not care about mortals. They might have all the power they need, but they literally don't care what happens to you. That's consistent with a lot of Greek mythology and particularly the Babylonian mythology, where a lot of the gods just did not care about the humans. At one point tried to drown them all because they were making too much noise. But you get to set the rules. You get to decide all this and you get to make your divine beings as you like them and get your players to take the cues from you about how they relate and what respect they're due and what powers they have and what it means for someone to follow one of these beings. So yeah, let's retire the term gods. Now, you might have your own opinions on it. I'm doubtless going to have lots of people that I know that will have strong opinions about it. You might want to go a completely different way with your campaign, but that's my suggestion. Have a think about it. Maybe have a play around with ideas. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Thanks for listening.